Welcome to Photoshop, where we're going to be spending the second portion of this class. Photoshop is an ultra-powerful photo editing tool, and it works in a raster-based environment. So unlike Illustrator, which worked in a vector-based environment, where shapes were defined by mathematics, in Photoshop we're going to be working with photos, things that are defined by pixels. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a photo here just to get started. Alright, so here's the Photoshop interface, and it's actually pretty similar to the Illustrator interface. Over on the left side we have a toolbar with a bunch of tools. Some of the tools have a little arrow next to them, and just like Illustrator, if you click and hold down, there's a little flyout menu that will give you other options of tools hidden under the main tool. The top there's this control or option area, and then over on the right there's a system of panels that are configurable, just like Illustrator. So if you find yourself looking for a certain panel, if I'm working on something and you don't have that in your interface, you can always go up to Window and add it through this drop down. So for instance, if you can't find the swatches panel, you can just go down to swatches and it'll add it to your interface. And sometimes it'll add it out here. You can always, put it into the side group or put it into one of these tab groups. However you want to work, this is a totally configurable area. So definitely set it up how it works best for you. Okay, so this is a photograph, which means it's pixel based. There are vector tools in Photoshop, but generally speaking, this is a tool that's all about raster. So if I zoom way in on this photo, and you can do this in similar ways to the way you work in Illustrator. So one way is just to use Command plus or Command minus. That'll zoom in or out. You can also hold down Alt or Option and scroll in. I'm using the scroll wheel on my mouse, but if you're using a trackpad, you can use whatever shortcut is configured for scrolling on your computer. And you can also use a few other hotkeys. Like for instance, Command 0 will always make the photograph fit into your screen, and Command 1 will always zoom into 100%. And 100% is particularly useful in Photoshop because what it does is it makes it so that each pixel in the photograph is being represented by one pixel on your screen. So this is a good way to see the photograph in its native resolution so that you can really see the detail in the right way. Okay, if I keep zooming in on this, you'll see that there is, a bunch of pixels here, and this is really how photographs are created in digital imaging. So all photographs are just a grid, and each one of the pixels in that grid has a slightly different color. And when you zoom out, it looks sharp and very realistic. Okay, so in Photoshop, when you zoom in, there's actually a little pixel grid that appears. If you don't like that pixel grid, you can always turn it off by going to View and down to Show, and then you can turn off the pixel grid if that's getting in the way. But pixel grid or no pixel grid, you can still see that this is clearly made up of a structure of pixels. Okay, so let's zoom back out. Okay, so let's go up to the top to the image menu and down to image size, because this dialog box will give us a bunch of information about our image and will allow us to make transformations to that image as well. So you can see currently our image is 4,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels in size. That's the number of pixels on the width end and on the height end that are defining that grid that is creating this image. So this is actually a 12 megapixel photo, because if you multiply 4,000 by 3,000, you get 12 million, and that's what megapixel stands for, is a million pixels total. Okay, so if I change this percent from 100 to 50%, and you can see that the height changed along with it, and that's because this little link is checked, which is going to constrain these two values to be the same, or to move in the same way rather. You can see that now at 50%, we've gone down to 2,000 pixels by 1,500 pixels. Okay, so those dimensions were cut in half, and if I click OK, I'm going to end up with an image that has dimensions that are half the size. So this image is actually kind of a quarter the size of the other image, because if you think about what happens when you reduce the dimensions by a half, you actually get something that is a quarter the size. So if I undo that by hitting Command Z, you can see that the new image, once I changed it to 50%, was kind of fitting in this area, which is a quarter of the size of the original image. Okay, let's go back up to image size really quick, because I want to show you that you can change these units to inches, okay? And right now this photo is 55.5 inches by 41.6 inches at 72 pixels per inch. Okay, so this resolution setting is telling us how dense the pixels are in this document to get a certain number of inches given the amount of pixels that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off resample for now. And you can see that if I change this resolution size to 300, okay, the inches goes down. And our final photo is actually still going to be the same. So we're not actually changing anything in the image size here. We're just defining the image to use a higher pixel density, which results in a lower number of inches. Okay, so, 10 inches at 300 is actually the same amount of height as 41.6 at 72. So the relationship here is going to, relate to the number of pixels that you have in your image. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and click resample again, because what this is going to do is it's going to change the dimensions of our pixels based on what we put here. So for instance, now with resample clicked, if I go back and type in 300, you can see now instead of changing inches to the correct amount based on the pixel dimensions that we had, it instead changed the pixels to make a 55 by 41 inch image at 300. Okay, so now we're going to be having an image that is 16,000 by 12,000 to create an image this size. So that is the basic way that this panel works, and it's a good thing to know about if you need to resize your image to a certain size. I'm going to go ahead and uncheck resample so we can just go back to the original value and just click OK. So now I'm back to where I was. Okay, so let's make some basic adjustments to this photograph. It's a really nice image. I like, the drone perspective, but it feels a little dark to me, so I'd like to make it a little bit brighter. The colors are also a little bit dull, so I want to make it a little bit more saturated as well. So let's go up to image, and if I go down to adjustments, you can see that there's a lot of different adjustments here. And one of the most basic ones is brightness and contrast. So I'm just going to go to that. Brings up this simple dialog box, and there's just two sliders, one for brightness. If I turn that up, you can see that it's going to brighten up our image. If I turn it down, it's going to darken the image. So I want to brighten up a little bit. Okay, and then there's also one for contrast. And contrast is something that increases the difference between lights and darks as I turn it up. So if I take contrast and make it really high, you can see that it takes all the bright areas like this van and makes it even brighter, and then takes the dark areas like the shadows in these trees and makes it even darker. Okay, and then if I go the other way, you can see that it kind of makes everything gray and feel washed out. That's because by turning down the contrast, we're reducing the distance between the lights and darks. So now those darks aren't as dark as they were, and the lights aren't as light as they were. Okay, so in order to get the right effect, in this case, I think turning up the contrast a little bit and turning up the brightness is going to be a good effect. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. Okay, so that's a very basic way to make an adjustment of brightness and contrast in Photoshop. Let's look at a little bit more of an advanced way using a function called levels. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that adjustment. Then let's go back up to Image and Adjustments and over to Levels. Okay, so this also allows you to adjust things like contrast and brightness, but it does it in a way that allows you to have a little bit more control. So the main portion of levels is this histogram area. And a histogram is a graph that shows all the different darkness and lightness values in the image. So you can see that right now there's not very much lights in the photograph. And that is true if you look at the photograph itself. There's not really any white in this image. There's like a little bit on the van, but that's actually more like a gray. And so the histogram shows that by not having any, actual area shown over towards the right side, which is where the lights are located. Okay, and then if you look, the histogram has a big spike of material over in the dark area. And again, that reflects what we're seeing in the image, because this image has a lot of darks in it. All the shadows in these trees, and even the trees themselves are kind of in this middle tone or in the darker tones. Then you can also see that there's no blacks. There's kind of a hole here at the very, very darkest end. So the way this photograph has been processed is so that there's a lot of darks, but there's no like pure blacks anywhere in the photograph. This is sometimes called a lifted black style. Okay, so what we can do to adjust this is use these endpoint sliders along with this midpoint slider. So what's going to happen is when I turn this black and pull it in, okay, you're going to see it's making the image darker, and it's actually clipping off everything that is to the left of this slider and making that pure black. Okay, so as I bring this in, it's taking all of this material and actually making it pure black. So you can see that, you know, it's making the image very dark, and anything that is on this side is actually going to go to pure black. So there's a lot of detail that I'm losing by moving this in, because it's converting all those areas and just flattening it to a pure black state. Okay, so that is going to be taking a little bit too far, but just to show you what that does, you know, as you move it in, more and more the photograph is going to become black. Okay, and then same with this slider on the right. If I move that in towards the left, it's going to take everything that is on the right side of this slider and make it pure white. So as I move this in, it's going to brighten up the image. And once again, you can see I'm losing some detail because it's taking more and more of the actual pixels in this photograph and making it pure white. So now I'm starting to lose the van because this entire road is starting to turn white. So this is, you know, obviously way too extreme, but that's what happens when you move that slider in. Okay, and so this is a good way to actually increase the contrast. If I move this in a little bit, I get more of those brightened up whites. And if I move this endpoint in, I get some darker darks. Okay, and so that is giving me more contrast because there's more distance between the dark values and the white values. So now that I have some pure blacks and I have more of a pure white, it feels higher contrast compared to when I didn't have those pure blacks, because those blacks weren't as rich and they weren't as different compared to the van as they are now. Okay, so that is a really basic way to work with levels. The midpoint is also really important. Basically, as I slide the midpoint over to the left, things are going to brighten up, and as I slide it over to the right, things are going to darken down. Okay, so if I slide it over to the left, this is probably what I'm going to do in most cases, because in a lot of situations, there's some shadow detail that you can bring out by sliding this over to that left. And this is definitely one of those cases. When I move it back to 1.0, which is the middle section, that's where it is by default. You know, as I slide it over here, you can see I'm really bringing out some of the details in those shadows and just overall lightening up this image and making it feel a little bit more appealing. Okay, so that is the basics of how levels works. And when I click OK, it's going to apply that to this image. Okay, so that's another way to brighten it up. And then let's go ahead and also turn up the saturation. That's another problem that I had, was that the colors of the trees feel a little dull. And that was actually helped a little bit by the fact that we increased the saturation, but it still feels a little dull to me. So let's go up to Image and over to Adjustments. And I'm going to go down to this one that says Hue and Saturation. Okay, so saturation is basically how vivid the colors are in an image. So if I take this saturation slider and slide it up, you can see that the colors get really, really bright and vivid. They almost get kind of radioactive. It doesn't feel natural at all. And if I slide it back to the other direction and subtract 79 saturation, it's almost going black and white. There's almost no color left in this image. If I actually take it down to 0, then it does go fully grayscale. So this has no color left in that photograph. So back to 0 so I can see what it looked like as at default. And let's just slide it a little bit higher so that I can get some of those richer fall colors, but I don't want to go so far that it gets out of hand. And you can always toggle preview on and off to see the before and after. And you can see it's pretty subtle, but it is bringing out some of the vibrant yellow tones in those trees and some of the greens, which are helping this feel a little bit more exciting. Okay, so going to go ahead and go with that +15 setting and click OK.